We're preparing to be on the internet, which is just
Yeah,
such a whole concept.
it is, isn't it?
Yeah. I was talking about the great ages of astrology with Shane M. Nygaard the other day, and
Yeah.
how in every new age, in the unconscious mind, the previous age stays there as well, and they have to work those things out. And I was thinking, my gosh, by the time we get to, the great age of Capricorn, they're going to be like, those poor people were Zooming. How sad for them.
Well, I mean, you could
Sad.
actually make a pretty good case for people not really getting the air mutation until Pluto gets into Aquarius. You
Oh,
could make a very good case for that. Because not because you have to always get a sign change of Pluto for that to happen, but because it's so soon, relatively after this shift has occurred.
yeah.
And so I think I think that's really a point that these last, roughly 5 degrees of Pluto in a sign are real bumpy.
Mhm.
And it's really when all of the stereotypes just come out and go, "Yeah," and everybody, and the anger level and the rage and all the stuff that Pluto can provoke um, just goes into overtime. And so yeah, I mean, we are still dealing with this kind of shift over um, from a kind of an earth-based system to an air-based system. And I was just experiencing this last week in one of those really silly, mundane ways that nonetheless shows you on a real basic level how these things work. And the way that this was for me was is that since 2006, Maggie and I had run a vacation rental property. And so I can advertise it now, right? Because I'm no longer involved. But it was a really nice cabin right on a trout stream in North Carolina. So log cabin on the creek, and and we had a blast doing it, I have to say. So, but this is, in a sense, you think that this is about as Earth as it can get. I've got all this Virgo in my chart. Maggie has a cap moon, so it's like this we really got off of this because property, real estate is about as earthy as you can get, right? And so we sold it last year, as it turns out. So just before the conjunction in December, we sold it in September. So we were out of the business. Well, watching how that business model had been changing since 2006 is really kind of fascinating from the standpoint of the mutation. Okay,
Mm.
because in the old days, where there was no internet, not that we were ever in that era, how did you advertise a cabin rental? How did people figure out? Because people love to get away in the summer or for the leaf changes. But how did you advertise it? And it was a really big hunking deal to try to figure, what leisure magazine do you advertise it? But if you've got a single cabin, who could afford to do it that way? So
Sure.
people used to go through the Chamber of Commerce, you know, and then the internet happens, and that, which, I think of the internet as very airy in
Hmm.
nature. And so then you got the development of things like VRBO and HomeAway and ultimately Airbnb and all these things. Okay, well, now, so here's your thing. Now, obviously, that first conjunction in the air was in 1980. So that's practically the whole growth of the internet. Not the invention, but the real development. So what happens? So when we got in 2006, the business model was you paid VRBO about $250 a year. And then if somebody put in Burnsville, North Carolina rental, they'd get our cabin and they'd get 20 or 30 other cabins or whatever people had, right? So we're basically paying for marketing and for advertising, which relative to real estate is air.
Mhm.
But in those days, because while the air piece was in place, it hadn't gotten to like a critical mass of dominance. So in those days, you still did your own thing. We were the owner. All the marketing was Log Cabins on Neil's Creek. And they saw pictures of us up on the site. Ta-da. Very earthy, basically. But as things moved along, that started to shift. Now, the first thing that started to shift is the companies like VRBO and Airbnb got huge. So suddenly air companies started to dominate what was literally an earth business. And so this process goes on through then we get what was called the changeover back into the one Jupiter, Saturn, and Earth that was still left on the table. And so then it was still feeling, this is in 2000, so it's still feeling like we are the owners, and we have our individual policies and all this stuff. So it's like we can still have the illusion that this is about real estate. The closer it starts getting to 2020, the less that becomes true. Because the first thing that happens is these companies like HomeAway and VRBO start all merging into one thing. The next thing is you pull up your ad, which, we as cabin owners were paying for these ads. And suddenly the ad, and at the bottom it says, looking for something else in the neighborhood? Why don't you try A, B, and C? And suddenly they're advertising other people's cabin on my site. Fundamental clash there, because of course, VRBO and Airbnb and all these companies figured out we can make more money doing this kind of cross advertising. And it's what it starts to do is it erodes the sense that we are the log cabins on Neil's Creek. And it becomes, we are simply a commodity that is being advertised. And now there are things we can't do. Like we can't do our old rate structure because Airbnb doesn't have it.
Mm.
And so now we're being driven to run our business in this megacorp way.
Right.
And now, just in the last year or two, with the actual changeover to air, there are these new companies like Evolve that have come along. We never dealt with this, but the people who bought it are not having to deal with this. Evolve now packages a deal to the owners where they keep you up on every single one of these stupid sites, which are all owned by maybe two companies.
Right.
So it's like, why do I need a company to package me to another company? But now you can't do it without Evolve, it seems. And so what we have now is derivatives. Because if you think of this is exactly when people were talking a number of years ago about financial derivatives, which are also air on top of earth. And so now we have this derivative where you need to have this other layer to be able to do it. And I was talking to this cabin owner in our area, and she was saying a third of her income is going to these companies.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking back to this, pay somebody $200 a year, what a steal. But now a third of your income. So it's like there's less and less reason to own property if you're thinking about this as a financial strategy, as an investment strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you think of something like Bill Gates, who owns more farmland in the US than anybody else, who's been buying up farmland. Now, I don't want to, I don't know what he wants to do with it, really. I don't understand what his strategy is, and I don't want to speculate because I don't know. But you think about this, and I'm thinking, this is a very earth play, but now we're in air. How is this going to work out? So it's a really interesting dynamic story.
Yeah,
so I think this Pluto thing, finishing off Pluto and Earth, I think a lot of these things where there's been this kind of subtle shift are going to become much more obvious. Some of the things where Earth went too far, because Cap is like ultra Earth. Where it went too far, it's going to be real obvious. And then, but once it shifts into Pluto, when Pluto shifts into Aquarius, it's going to be like, And I think this is where these issues like with cryptocurrencies, um, with the sustainability issue of cryptocurrencies, is that an earth into air statement or what?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to watch either way because as we are watching Pluto in these last degrees, it's interesting because I feel like we already know what it is. We've seen it. We've been looking at it. This is not new. It's continuing to kind of die it off. Like you said, when Earth went too far, this is not sustainable. We can't achieve Capricorn with this anymore. So there's this kind of global, right, idea of that is resonating right there. And then as Pluto takes that ingress into Aquarius, I think we get a little sizzle to the back of the hairs on the back of our neck because it's like, oh, this is what we were saying. Oh, okay. Okay, this is that, and
Yeah.
it's like, but
Oh,
this
yeah.
is where I also think that the universe is kind, where it's like, maybe listen to your astrologers, maybe listen to your economists right now because they are telling you what is on the way. Like you've seen this stuff, but you maybe don't get how to use that tool yet. But here, you want to make sure you definitely have it in your backpack
Hmm. Oh, yeah.
because we're going to start to move and we're going to die off air concepts, just like you said. Yeah, you can own farmland, good job. But what are you going to do? Probably put windmills, put towers, put airy things on it. Build. We're going to need to build med, tech, whatever it is. Communes are coming back, turns out. For some places, I do understand they never went out, but that is coming back.
Well, and you can think about that also on even a kind of a micro level, because the next level down from that is the one that just kind of got skipped in many places like the US over the past 40, 50 years, which is, what is this thing called the nuclear family?
Mm-hmm.
Because a commune is people living together. Well, hey, that's what people did before there was a nuclear family. That's what people do in a lot of countries, because there is an intrinsic logic to people living together as communities. We are social animals.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of advantages. I think the issue and what kind of drove, two things I think drove the shift to the nuclear family. And one was the economics of wanting the corporate widgets to be able to move around whenever they wanted them to. But the other factor being that one of the things that was building in the later part of the Earth triplicity, was nonconformist lifestyles.
Mm-hmm.
And that within a family environment can be extremely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I think people are getting that about this now much more than they used to. And that means that some of those restrictions that people saw with living multi-generationally are starting to disappear, have largely disappeared, but people don't necessarily know it.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting to have all of these generations on the planet at the same time right now. We have a vast array of thinking that's
Yeah,
happening, but we're all having to go and shift at the same time, like new language, new communication. It's all happening now. And I think we've got some time until it settles in, but it's happening amongst all of these generations. So the profound, I think when humans have a mind change, it's a little bit of a spiritual experience. So I think even in that vein, we're having a little spiritual experiences, little rearrangements and perspectives that are more profound than we are giving them credit for because,
absolutely.
the people
You
that are
know,
in
when
the
you
hundreds, yeah.
when you think about this, the last shift like this was the beginning of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And the one before that was the beginning of the 17th century. Just compare the age curves. Now, when you have one of these situations where you go into the new element, and then the next one you go back to the old element, then the next one you go back to the new element, that's a 40-year period. In a culture where the average life expectancy was about 30, basically you didn't have people at the end of it except relatively few.
Sure.
who even remembered the old system in its totality.
Right.
Now you've got two full generations who do. It's
And they have
wild.
some things to say about it as
Yeah,
well, right? That's the
yeah.
thing, because that is also, I think that's another thing to keep in mind is when you don't have generations living to really influence the other generation so presently,
Hmm.
this shifts. I think it can become kind of that unconscious, subconscious information. My grandparents used to do this, but it's like, oh, well, guess what? My great grandparents are here and they have some things to say about how I'm living, right? That becomes a different kind of influence in society. It's another voice or set of voices, essentially,
Hmm.
that will, here we are trying to figure it out.
Hmm. Yep,
That's a lot.
it's a lot indeed.
It's a lot. That's why we need summer tonics.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit. So, what I wanted to talk about is basically this. When you do medical astrology is based on the old system of medicine, the Hippocratic system, the system of Galen, the system of Avicenna, but also the system of William Lilly and Guido Bonatti and Richard Saunders and all these great astrological types. Nicholas Culpeper, certainly.
Mhm.
And what that means is that they had a completely different idea of disease than the one that we have in our heads now. So, you can't say how would Lilly have picked a rulership for COVID because we have no idea. But he didn't have to because their system was not based on trying to correlate, say, a planetary rulership system with a pathogen. This pathogen idea, and I think this is really important for us as astrologers to understand this. The pathogen system really came into the fore in the middle part of the 19th century. And it was the work, at least for a pure popularization of Louis Pasteur. Now, by the fact that I talked about popularization, don't think that I am rejecting the germ theory of disease. It's like we know the COVID virus is associated with COVID, just as we know the flu virus is associated with flu. And so this idea is fairly established. But what I'm going to say further is, but it's not enough.
Mhm.
Okay, it's just this was really, really sexy to 19th century reductionists. Um, but what is usually not presented anymore is that when Pasteur came up with this idea, he was working. What shot him to fame, quite honestly, was he worked on industrial applications, and he wasn't doing pure research. He was doing applied, which is honestly what most scientists have done over the years. Okay, so he looked at why wine soured, which was a really significant thing for wine growers. And he looked at other kinds of industrial problems like that. So the thing was, at the time, he got into a big, big um, argument over what at the time was referred to as this idea of the pathogen or the idea of what was called the terrain. And here's how it works. And astrologically, this should make a lot of sense. Okay, so pathogen idea, okay, so you have COVID as a virus, it causes a disease. So pathogen disease. So whether it's um, you know, you have the wrong base of yeast and you're trying to make wine and that produces side effects or whatever. But the other side of it is this. So in a given population, not everybody gets a disease. Now, I'm going to pull it back from COVID because we all have too many big emotional associations with that one. And we'll talk about flu. So every flu season, first of all, every flu season, the flu is a little different, which is why when they do flu shots, they do a different strain of flu. You can't take the 2020 flu vaccine in a 2021 year and have any expectation it'll work. Now, honestly, the odds of it working are probably somewhere around 30 to 50% because they're having to make these vaccines before the flu season comes along. So they're guessing as to what strains it'll be.
Mm-hmm.
But it's based, the science there is pretty clear and pretty unequivocal theoretically here. I mean, I'm not addressing the issue which, where you are about vaccines, but just about the theory of vaccines, which is really also going back to Pasteur primarily, although there were vaccines before him. But here's the issue, and my first job out of my PhD was a postdoc at the Public Health Research Institute in New York. And so when I was there, we'd sit around because about a third of the people on my floor were actually researching flu. And so I'd say things like, well, okay, so you got to figure in New York City, every single person is exposed to flu everywhere.
Sure.
Why doesn't everybody get sick? Okay, well, in the 19th century, this is where they would have talked about the terrain. Okay, which is the terrain is that each of us has what, is now kind of biochemically described as immunity. Okay, which is that I'm walking around in a biological state which may make me susceptible to any disease or a particular disease, and you're walking around in a different biological state. And if your immune system is weak, then you get sick. And if your immune system is strong, you don't get sick. Okay, now that's basically where the terrain was, is to say, yes, there could, and this is what's so stupid. Okay, the easy solution here is to say, okay, you have a bug and you have terrain. So they're both there, so what's the big deal? But Pasteur, in his French Academy, macho science in the 19th century way had to win. And so he minimized the terrain. He talked about the pathogen. And so, but the thing with this is that there isn't a disease out there where there is an expression of you get exposed to the bug 100% of the time you get the disease. That just doesn't exist. So, and it's in that range of why don't you get the disease that astrological medicine occurs or medical astrology occurs. Because we as astrologers and as students of astrology should be able to start to identify who is more likely to get a disease in a particular period of time, a very critical word for astrology, and who is less likely to get it in a particular period of time. And that idea should basically be shown in our method for how we look at our bodies operating through time.
Okay.
So that's the concept we're working with. Now, put this into practice a bit. Okay, so like now, we're about to go into summer. Each of the seasons has qualities that look exactly like our elements. So summer is hot and dry. Fire is hot and dry. Okay, so being in summer is like temporarily walking around as at least a partial fire sign. Okay, to kind of simplify matters. Now, partial fire sign. The four elements. Okay, fire is associated with hot and dry. Earth is associated with cold and dry. Water is associated with cold and wet. And air is associated with hot and wet. If the season is hot and dry, who's most affected by it? Okay, well, it's either going to be the hot and dry people who are going to be getting hotter and drier still, or it's going to be the cold and wet people.
Right.
Okay. So the cold and wet people are the phlegmatics, just as the hot and dry people are the cholerics. So that's fire and water. Okay, so for those of you who've never computed temperament, okay. Now, first of all, I have to tell you that I'm not convinced that temperament was generally even computed astrologically, because from the time of the Greeks forward, and you can see it in Shakespeare, for example, everybody just knew the four temperaments, and everybody could recognize Shakespeare refers to this constantly in his plays. Now, he wouldn't have been just throwing this out there as an educational process.
Sure.
Shakespeare was writing popular theater in the day. So, and, especially considering the level of really intense sexual jokes in all the Shakespearean plays, he was writing to entertain people. And so, here he is in the midst of making these absolutely outrageous statements that way. And so now, if he's referring to a temperament, it's like, this is not a head scratcher for his audience.
Sure.
So all of us would look at people and say, you are, and when that's true, when you are, from childhood trained to look for this, you don't need an astrology chart to compute it. But for those of us who aren't,
for us mere mortals,
yeah, for us, 21st century mere mortals, look at the sun, look at the moon, look at the ascendant, look at the ruler of the ascendant. And that's going to approximate your temperament type. Look at them by element. Now, the thing is, most people, when I say that, will be going, but wait a minute. My sun is in Cancer, my moon's in Leo, my ascendant Scorpio, and the ruler of my ascendant Mars is in Capricorn. I don't have one temperament, right? Most people don't. Most people don't have a unitary temperament. But what happens there is you're unmixed. And I think historically, most people were mixes. It's the people who have the pure ones who are kind of like the stereotypes. But what this starts to give you, what that gives you is the complexity. That's why not everybody reacts the same way to things.
Sure.
But if you've got, like right now, either strong fire or water in your chart, and I will add that if there's something like, say you've got this freaking stellium with Mercury, Venus, Mars in a particular sign in the first house, that's going to play, even if that's not the official computation. It's like looking at the chart and saying, honestly, which are the most important elements in this person's chart? Okay, so fire and water are the two we're interested in. So it's kind of like in summer, Earth, Earth and air are kind of off the hook right now. But so fire. From a medical standpoint, what do we look at with fire? Okay, well, anybody who's fiery is, well, fiery. So when we talk about somebody who's of the nature of fire, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about somebody who's likely to fly off the handle, is quick to criticize, is pretty clear about what they want, not somebody who's going to be subtle about it, not somebody who's going to jam themselves down and not tell you what they're thinking or feeling. It's like in your face.
Yeah.
That's the fiery type. And I'm not saying any of this stuff to criticize, because these four types are real. And if somebody genuinely is fire, one of the worst things for them medically would be to try to stop being fired. It's like, who are you kidding? But anyway, so somebody who is of that type, or somebody who's watery. Okay, now the watery type is cold and wet. One of the things about the choleric type, the fire type, is also being very dry. The two dry types, the fire and earth, tend to view the world in discrete packets. They don't tend to connect the dots as much as watery people, whereas watery people or people with who have wetness, which includes the sanguine types, do connect the dots very much more.
Sure.
So that's part of it. And the cold types generally don't express what they're really feeling because they don't want to hurt people's feelings, or they're shy. Basically cold corresponds to introvert and hot corresponds to extrovert. So now, as you said, coming off of COVID and coming off of that whole thing, the introverts have been going, oh, I really liked how the last year worked. And the extroverts are going, yeah, get me out of here.
Yeah.
And especially the cholerics are going, get me out of here. Because that's a choleric going through a quarantine is going to go absolutely crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is so not who they are.
Right.
And we can certainly understand astrologically, if you are put in an environment where you are forced to be not you, and I mean in a really in your face not you go bonkers.
Sure. And they're expressive. They are very expressive people. Then you put them in a box and they're going to be expressive in that box.
Mm-hmm. And they're going to be punching the side of the box to get out of the box.
Yes.
So that's the choleric energy. So now here's the thing. We're now going into literally a hot and dry season because that's really what summer is. So what this does to a choleric person is go, yes! Okay, more heat and dryness. Now, of course, this means right now in terms of, the exit from COVID land, I thought it was hysterical when Biden months ago said, everything's going to be normal by July 4th. Okay, because July 4th, of course, falls in the summer. And who are the people who have been most crazy about the and I'm not saying crazy bad. I'm just saying this is your wiring. And wiring is something we really can't change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they've been up against this whole thing. And now Biden's saying, okay, July 4th, everything's okay. And you see how now so many places are dropping the COVID restrictions as we're going into this heated period. So that whole choleric scene is going to just be going up and away on this.
Sure.
And everybody else is going, I can finally get out of my house. Now the introverts are going, no, please don't. Okay.
Put in here though. Yeah.
But generally, we even in a non-COVID year, most people in the summer, they get out more. They go out and do things. Doing things is very choleric. So suppose somebody gets confronted with a problem. Okay, now a very cold way to deal with that is to wait for it to go away.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, whereas a hot way is, let's do something about it. And that sense of doing, whether it's that doing solving problems or just, I want to go out and play in the woods, that's all very choleric. So the season is driving this. We feel more comfortable in the summer. In fact, a lot of the time it's like, I've got to get out. I've been trapped in the house, even under normal circumstances.
Sure.
So all of this is to say that the seasonal already tends to heat us up. And as we get heated up in any way, we overheat. So the danger for a choleric in the summer is overheating. But so how does this work out in terms of how we experience this? What can we do about it? Because here's the point. All of the old medicine says that when you get out of balance is when you get sick. Now, what we as astrologers add to the statement is, yeah, and I'll tell you about your out of balance with that Pluto square in your sun. You know,
Mhm.
I'll tell you about that out of balance when Uranus is sitting on your Venus. I'll tell you about that out of balance when Mars comes crashing down on your Jupiter. Um, in other words, what I'm saying and what is obvious to us is anytime you've got a significant planetary transit, and you could say transit, progression, perfection, any of the systems you like to use for dynamics. When you've got that happening, you're having to adjust to whatever this interloper is. And so, but now what I'm saying is because you can look at the nature of the planet itself, and you can look at the sign that's in, you can translate that into an elemental challenge, as it were.
Mm.
So, like right now, Mars has gone from Cancer to Leo. Okay, so Mars by nature is hot and dry. So Mars in Cancer is like, oh, do I have to play around in this watery mess? I don't like this. And that's basically a part of why Mars is considered to be in fall, um, in Cancer and exalted in Capricorn is that while the Mars in Capricorn is cold, it's in a dry sign. And Mars, you know, the dry part is Mars making, as we say, a really cutting remark. That cuttingness is dry. And here is poor Mars in Cancer trying to be diplomatic. And, Mars is just not cut out for it.
Yeah,
Cut
no.
out for it. So, but now it's in Leo. And so Mars and Leo aren't quite the best fit because that's the sun's sign. But Mars is comfortable there.
Yeah, he's
So
like,
Mars
I
is
can
like,
resonate a little bit.
ah, yeah. And so here we are. We haven't quite made it into the summer period, that caloric period, but Mars has already dragged us in there. So, um, so already so to speak, the heat level is climbing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't want to overheat. Now, I'm not saying that a little bit of heat can't help us at all, because
Mhm.
we have to be able to go through all four of the temperaments because we have to go through all four of the seasons. But what we want to talk about with tonics is not that, but how this process can make us more out of balance, which can then make us more susceptible to disease. So, um, one of the biggest things with the cholerics has to do with fat. Something simple, something basic, fat. Why? Of course, fat is the most caloric part of our diet, and it's also a part that burns.
Mhm.
Because what do we do with fat? We throw it in the pan and saute something. And so it's very much it's the flavor carrier. When you go onto a low fat diet, why do most people go crazy with it? They say, I can't taste the food.
It's crazy.
And so what we have to talk about is good fats and bad fats. And to me, this is the kind of interesting stuff because we've got a very old concept here. When you're talking about Hippocrates, you're talking about somebody who lived 400 BC. That's a long time ago. But now when I'm talking about fats, I'm talking about stuff that has been learned over the last 50 years.
Mhm.
Um, but what we've come to realize is there's fat, there's fat, and there's fat. And so in a hot time, the nature of the fats or oils you're eating becomes very important and very critical to things working. Um, One of the worst things for choleric is just about everything we call a junk food. Because why? What's junk food? It's rancid. It's trans fat. It's stuff that is overcooked or where the smoke point of the oils has not been observed properly.
Mm.
It's fake fat. You know, it's all these different ways. So things like French fries. We all love them, but we know that that you have to be careful with them. And the major reason we have to be careful with them is that it's so easy for the oil to smoke. It's so easy, especially commercially, to get rancid fats. And you get
Mm,
a choleric rancid fat, and it's like you just lit the fire. Okay, and so this is like going to be a number one thing here for talking about getting into the summer and keeping a better balance. Watch your fats. And I'm not saying anything here about don't eat fat. I'm saying don't be stupid with fat.
right. Have your
And
French fries with a lot of water.
well,
Balance.
drink water with your French fries. That's one for sure. But also don't just go to a place that doesn't change the oil.
Sure.
Or better, uses recycled oil.
Make them at
Now,
home, friends.
yeah,
Make them at home.
that's right. That's right. And make it at home with an oil that doesn't have extra ingredients.
Sure. Sure.
Heinz 57 oil is not what you just don't want to be putting into your body anyway. But it's worse for the clerics because when we talk about that whole complex and astrologically, that's the gallbladder.
Mm-hmm.
And look at all the folks who unfortunately have gallbladder problems, which if your family has any tendency toward that, you need to be able to recognize the symptoms. Their gallbladder headaches, their gallbladder backaches.
Yeah.
And and just eating too much mystery fat. And we're all out doing junk food because you're out at the beach and you didn't bring enough, or that stuff on the menu, that greasy stuff on the menu just really appeals to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah. Or you're still, depending on where you're at in the house, and just you can't have one more vegetable. So it's like Oreos it is.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's stupid things because the fact that you bought something on the shelf does not guarantee it didn't become rancid.
Sure.
Last year I had gone last fall. I wanted to make up a chickweed oil because if anybody has skin itching problems, chickweed is amazing. It's a plant that nobody pays attention to because it's tiny little, these little green dots on your lawn. Now, strangely enough, I have a patch of chickweed right next to my front door. And herbalists will tell you, and I happen to believe this is true, that whatever you need tends to be in your environment.
Mm.
So, and my partner's a choleric, so there you go. Chickweed is great for itching. So I was making up a chickweed oil, and I got to the end of the thing, and we went to use it, and it was like the itching got worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I had made it with olive oil, and I happened to grab that bottle of olive oil to make a salad. I was like, ooh, what's this smell? And then I realized not only was my salad oil rancid, but my chickweed oil was rancid. And that absolutely reversed the herbal effect that I should have gotten because that oil was rancid.
Right.
So these are, this is one of the biggest things I could possibly emphasize. Now, just as this affects cholerics, it affects phlegmatics. You talk about the phlegmatic temperament. If the choleric is the one who said, I want X, Y, Z, and of course, the last thing you want is a choleric boss because they're telling you exactly how to do your job. But the phlegmatic is kind of known as the couch potato, which means there's already this kind of, oh, chips.
Yeah. They're already
Yes.
sitting
Yeah.
pretty.
Yeah. They're equally affected
Mm-hmm.
by these issues. So what these two groups need to be doing is exactly what was the traditional summer thing that kind of got lost in the fact that now we eat everything all the time, whatever we want, whatever season, whatever global, what do you want to have today? Okay, I'll have Ukrainian food. What do you want to have tomorrow? Oh, I'll have Italian. But in this kind of global food mix, again, we're not paying attention to these things, but these are big ways to stay healthy. The season is in this case of hot and dry, watch the oil. Um, the the phlegmatic portions, watch how much water you're consuming because you need more in the summer. Duh.
Burn
If
it
you're
off.
if you're getting a blast of hot and dry, what's it doing? Our bodies are 97% water. It's taking the water out. So we've got to balance with that as well.
Yeah,
So
whatever keeps it light and movable and hydrated.
lettuce, but let's talk about lettuce. I'm not talking about iceberg.
Well, that's just crunchy water, so that's fine.
Yeah, it's crunchy water. What do you like about crunchy water? Well, the water part's fine, but the crunchy, it's like, I'm not sure. Pretty much all the other lettuces have more to them. I'm going to say it's very interesting. In Europe, there's a whole series of wild lettuce that people typically eat in salad because they more traditionally grow their lettuce than we do. There's a variety of lettuce that's called the genus name is Lactuca virosa, and it's the wild lettuce. This stuff has taste like an iceberg could never imagine. But the other thing is it's more therapeutically interesting. So, but you've got things like lettuce, you've got cucumbers, you've got all of these, whether it's the fruits, whether it's the leafy vegetables. Cholerics and phlegmatics need lots of green leafy vegetables, to really have a good grip on their temperament. Because when you talk about adjusting people by humor, the ways you do it are what they used to call regimen. And this, by the way, is the same whether you're talking about Western medicine or Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine. All these great cultural systems of medicine had the same idea that that people need to be balanced. And when they get out of balance, they're susceptible to disease. So when there's an excess of heat, you give cool. And the cool things are things that first of all, you don't eat as much at high temperature. Almost any dish, if you have a choice of eating it hot or you're eating it cold means that there's less heat in the dish as far as how you experience it. Now, you may not like cold pasta, but you can also pick recipes that are more, are better for that. So,
and if it's hot season, you maybe do like cold pasta now.
Yeah.
Down.
Yeah, and you're not going to do that in the middle of winter when you do want to eat that.
Bring on the oatmeal and the warm, beautiful soups.
Yeah. Now, it's not a mortal sin to eat oatmeal in the summer, but
it's just going to stick with you longer. It's so hot.
It just isn't the desire. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now there are two other parts to regimen besides food. But I know this is eat and greet, so of course we had to talk about food first. The two issues of sleep and exercise, because those three factors together covered about 90 to 95% of the traditional understanding of regimen. The sleep pieces, think of sleep itself as being primarily cold. Okay, because part of the choleric piece actually is that a lot of the activity that we think of as what we do during the day is hot. When you're asleep, it's not that you're totally inert, but you're not moving around so much. The body temperature tends to drop.
Sure.
So how much sleep you get. The less sleep you get, the more choleric it is. Okay, and think about it. When you don't get enough sleep, you get crappy.
Fired up.
You snap at everybody. Yeah. You're just grumpy. And the other thing is exercise. Okay, now in Hippocrates' day, he talked about exercise as being of two types, running and wrestling. Now, if you substitute for wrestling something like judo or martial arts or tai chi, you're closer to the point because running is just pure hot, dry marathon, you know, leave it on the track.
Hmm.
And doing that in the middle of summer can for unless you're a professional athlete and you've trained with this and you're really paying attention to how much hydration you're using, it can be very enervating for the average person.
Sure.
What Hippocrates referred to as wrestling is more like you're doing flexibility, and it's not designed to work up a sweat, but it can be every bit as intense. I mean, a Pilates workout, a Tai Chi workout may not leave you sweating bullets, but it's pretty intense.
Sure. Well, and it's summertime. People like to work out together. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
that's wonderful as well. It's good for your blood pressure.
sure,
Hmm.
sure. So those are the general things to help make adjustments.
Mm.
And now, the only thing I think left to add to this astrologically is to be aware of the general qualities of the planets. I've mentioned the elements, but if we go through the planets, we should start with the moon because the moon is just so significant in matters of the body. The moon is cold and wet. The sun is hot and dry. Mercury, Mercury is all over the place because, and everybody said this in the old days, Mercury assumes the qualities of the planets it's with.
Sure. Hmm.
Venus is wet. Now, some of the sources differentiated the Occidental and the Oriental Venuses differently. I tend to think, and I can see the point of it. If you have a Venus that rises before the sun, you're considered to be much more fiery
Sure. Hmm.
than if your Venus rises after the sun.
Hmm.
So you can make adjustments for that, but definitely wet. Mars is hot and dry and very hot and dry because if the sun's hot and dry, Mars is like trying to be twice as much. Now, obviously, this isn't the same as these bodies in the solar system, but this is how they work astrologically. Jupiter is hot and wet, Saturn is cold and dry, and now we punt on the other planets because we have to now come up with a way of assigning the qualities. And I think when you're dealing, one way to think of this is hot always increases the amount of energy in the system. And another way of thinking about the wet dry is that since wet is cohesive and dry is a bit disruptive. Okay, so what would we call Uranus? Well, it's got to be dry because it is disruptive.
It's
No,
disruptive.
you're pretty kinky if you're making new friends and keeping them in a Uranus transit. You can make them and lose them, but you know,
Yeah.
cohesiveness with Uranus is kind of no. Um, so, but as for whether it's hot or dry, hot or cold, that's a little more variable with Uranus. You can, or I say more often than not, Uranus probably increases the amount of activity, but right now we've got Uranus in Taurus. So, right now we can be making big changes, and especially over this last year with the pandemic, you're making big changes, but you're making them at home. You're making them quietly. That's colder,
Mhm.
but definitely disruptive. Neptune, cold and wet. I
Cool.
mean, you don't even have to think about that one. It's the great ocean. Pluto, again, it's kind of circumstantial. Um, I tend to think of Pluto probably less positively than a lot of modern astrologers because I think of Pluto when I think of big events that are beyond the scale of normal human sense organs. And in this sense, that the big changes, like talking about how Pluto moving into Aquarius and Capricorn affects people, it's not that we don't register it. but these changes are happening on a scale bigger than we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of dealing with Pluto is the fact that you just got whacked by a 2x4, that you didn't choose to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of what we end up doing with Pluto is figuring out how do you survive this now that it's happened.
Yeah, I,
Um,
I agree. I equate Pluto with labor a
yeah,
lot. We're like, yeah, I mean, I have a vague idea of what's going to happen,
yeah,
but when you are in it, there is a whole layer of, oh my God, that was previously unavailable to your psyche. But at the same time, when it's over, you can't quite remember it either. You just know you survived it.
well,
It's
and I
really,
think the other thing mythologically is when Pluto decided he had the hots for Persephone, her opinion didn't matter.
yes. Well, as a person who's done labor, I want to
Yeah,
assure you that my doctor told me at that point my opinion did not matter
yeah,
about some things.
yeah, it doesn't matter. Um, so disruptive, absolutely, absolutely. But again, it can be hot or cold.
Yeah.
And I think these are the things we look at that we adjust. You know, you've got the question right now with Pluto and Capricorn. Well, how compatible is that with your Pluto sign or with your chart? Um, so we can kind of look at the hows of the disruption and see whether it makes sense to really talk about that on a hero basis.
Well, there's solution is kind of what I heard.
Yeah,
Amongst all of it, there's solution. And do you feel like, just in a social way, with the season and we've got the caloric energy happening, that information acts as things we need to figure out what we're digesting as well?
yes. And especially because we're talking, when you're talking about choleric, you're talking about the fire signs. When you're talking about the, the day signs, I think, now, first of all, in astrology, honestly, while it is historically accurate, I think we have to largely bury talking about masculine and feminine signs.
Mm,
So I tend to talk now about diurnal and nocturnal signs.
okay.
And I think the thing there is that actually doing it that way is superior, not merely on a level of politics, but on a level of what it actually means to us in practice, which is, I
Mm,
think, why it's an important shift. Because the diurnal signs by nature tend to be more active than the nocturnal signs.
sure.
And so when you've got, well, it's like right now we've been dealing with this Mercury retrograde in Gemini. Now there's a whole host of issues with the fact that it's in domicile, but it's also in a diurnal sign. And so, it's not like action is sitting this one out.
Yeah.
There's been a lot that's been going on in this period of time, and it's not all negative.
Mhm.
In fact, I'd say the bulk of it isn't negative, and that's in part the domicile. But it's like all this action going on. Digesting information, whether we're talking about here on the internet where we're playing right now, or whether you're talking about people talking to you, whether it's reading, it's all the way we get information. All
Mm.
this is just like hyperactive the more of the diurnal signs are around.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like that too. Just even, I think the internet is, Google is a great feed to watch during different seasons,
Oh,
what's
sure.
going on. Even, I noticed even as we were more in the United States, anyways, we were more in our winter time, things are cooler and there's a slow to it. Even the Google feed
Mhm.
changed a bit less. And we're coming towards summer and it's this and this and this and this and this. And that can be a lot systematically just to try and keep up too, depending on your temperament as well, I would think.
Sure, sure. And right now, of course, you're seeing a lot of the signs moving into fire. A lot of the planets are moving into fire, and they're
Mhm.
not all there yet. But as that happens, yeah, it's like the pop up in the amount of activity that's going on, and also the level of complaints. I mean, one of the things you're seeing lots of articles about right now is the number, for example, the number of passengers flying who are flying off the handle.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an obvious fire illusion.
Sure. Well, and I think it's so much more intense because we did just come off of quarantine. So it is,
Sure.
we're going to always see the season be a bit more lush with commentary. But after it's been packed in a small space for a very long time, near there, it's like a woof
Yeah.
coming at
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
Wow. So making sure we take the tonics, eat,
Yeah.
drink, be merry, but make sure it's wise. Watch your
Mm-hmm.
content absorption at this
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Make your own
good
French
fats
fries.
even with content.
Yeah.
Right, right. Make your own French fries, make your own friends and your own content. But no
Yeah.
matter what you do, just drink water.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
hot
This season anyway.
this season. And
Yeah.
in the next season, we'll get back to
Yeah,
just
and I think this is one of the things that all of these admonitions that get thrown at you, like you have to drink so many ounces a day. Well, that's provisional. And I think we, we as astrologers have bought into some of these absolute rules. And we
oh,
should
sure.
immediately be going, wait a minute, water is an element.
Mhm.
And being an element, the amount that we need is in part dependent on our charts, duh, on the season of the year, on how much stress our chart is taking in at this time.
Sure, sure.
So always we should be the ones who are the first to say, this needs adjusting.
Is this working? And what a
Yeah.
wonderful season to be evaluating, is this working, is this not? We are
Yeah,
finishing.
because honestly, being a little more choleric, you're picky. And and you can be more, I think you can be, in a sense, more honest, and not just necessarily honest to yourself, but ask for what you need.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to drink that much water, but I will drink this. Those are
Yeah,
perfectly profound statements, as long as you can do what you need to do, right?
exactly.
But it does, the heat brings that out a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah,
Ah, so we've had some tonic. We've had a little talk today about maybe how to bring the temperature down or at least normalize it. Come
yeah,
into some kind of balance, I think, as we're coming into the summer season, which is a big deal. Mars moved into Leo. We're ready to go, but it's like, well, hold on. Make sure you're clear on what you're doing and that you're thinking, your body, your emotions are balanced and what you're going to do so they're not just impulsive.
hmm,
You know, yeah.
exactly.
Exactly. Man, it's always fun when I talk to you. I sometimes feel like I'm not even doing the interview. I'm like, yes, tell me more. Say more beautiful and interesting things. But it's always a delight. Thank you for coming to chat with us.
Sure, I always enjoy it.
Well, you'll definitely be invited back in the chat room. Was perfectly happy to see you here as well. So, all right, you guys, we had some beautiful time together today, and hopefully it was worth the time you took to show up. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time. And I will, of course, make sure that Lee's information is absolutely below this video.